The BBC is the only British broadcaster to have news correspondents permanently based in Islamabad, Baghdad, Gaza, Kabul, Jakarta, Shanghai, Paris, Cairo, Rome, Seoul, Sydney, the UN and Tehran, which means when a story breaks,
live to Beirut now,
we're already there.
It's obviously a very difficult
BBC
time.
News 24, whenever you need to know.
Thank you, Chair, Congress. Micky Nicholas, Fire Brigade Union, speaking on behalf of the TUC Racial Relations Committee. First of all, on behalf of that committee, I appreciate that Congress stood for a moment's silence in commemoration of the bicentennial of the Slave Trade Abolition Act and paid its respects to all those enslaved Africans who struggled, rebelled, sacrificed, and those who paid the ultimate price during their enslavement. Over 400 years, more than 25 million people were enslaved, leading to the colonisation of Africa and the problems that that continent still has today. Congress, the enslavement of millions of human beings wrenched from the African continent was the most odious and reprehensible crime against humanity within modern history. That the English ruling classes then managed to rewrite history and perpetuate many myths while self-congratulating themselves on slavery's gradual and eventual abolition is, in itself, also almost a crime. The abolitionists in the UK indeed played an important part, but they were not dragged from their homes, deprived of their history and culture, degraded and killed. Congress, never ever forget who were at the forefront of the struggle against the enslavement of African people, the enslaved themselves. The struggle that was enacted in this country was the first modern historical act of working class and poverty-stricken people campaigning and organising against an issue that they saw as having a worthwhile cause. Their initial gripe may well have been about their own exploitation, but the reality of having no rights and no representation left them sympathetic and understanding of their direct link to slavery. The subsequent campaign was a template for the development of the trade unionism some 40 years before the Tolpuddle uprisings. So what has been the trade union movement's response to the bicentennial commemoration? The commemoration of an Act of Parliament that working people campaigned for and finally won. In the trade union movement, there has a disproportionate representation of descendants of enslaved Africans. There is so much more we can and should be doing. There are some polite suggestions within the resolution that I sincerely hope all affiliates will act upon. Congress, the descendants of the enslaved deserve an annual Remembrance Day. They deserve a permanent monument commending the struggle for freedom. They deserve a process of reparation to atone for the enslavement and its sad and negative consequences. The Remembrance Day has widespread support, and we need to campaign to bring that to fruition next year. A space has been acquired in Hyde Park and a permanent memorial has been commissioned. Our movement now needs to support and contribute towards that cost. And the vexed and complex issue of reparation now needs to be fully discussed, debated and decided upon. The Black Workers' Conference made a statement on the very issue, and I'd like to thank the members, the Black Members Committee of the RMT and their NEC for so far being the only affiliate to convene a conference on this issue. I sincerely hope that more will follow. Reparation can take place in many forms. There's a personal, a societal and of course a financial reparation. Trade unions, the representatives of many descendants of the enslaved, need to be at the forefront of these discussions. It's time to educate and inform our movement about the link between slavery and racism, about the link between lost culture and the disengagement we see in some of our black youths, about the link between self-worth and a lost history, African and British. The Abolition Act and the Slavery Amendment Act came in order to pay reparation and compensation to the slave industry. After the Second World War, there was reparation for the Holocaust. American institutions have started reparation and atonement programs for Afro-Americans. Congress, if it was good enough for those people, then it's surely good enough for the Bank of England, Lloyd's of London, Church of England, Barclays Bank, and many other existing institutions and industries who profited and built their very foundation on the whipped backs of enslaved Africans. And finally, let us never forget those whose courage ensured freedom for those who followed. And I'll end it with this, in the words of an anonymous enslaved African. They will remember that we were sold, but they will not remember that we were strong. They will remember that we were bought, but not that we were brave. Congress, support the resolution, and let's start doing a great deal more than we've done so far.
Thank you very much. Let's call PCS.
President, Congress, ZITA HOLBOURNE, PCS, a member of the TUC Race Relations Committee, seconded motion 28. There have been many events this year marking the bicentenary of the Act abolishing the trading of African people as slaves. Much undeserved credit has been given to William Wilberforce for putting the Act before Parliament. I vowed until now not to mention him myself, but it's angered and it's offended me that in comparison little acknowledgement has been given to the bravery and determination of African people in ending slavery. We just listened to the Prime Minister commend British people only for ending the slave trade. Wilberforce was no friend of trade unionists. He supported the slave trade for much of his life, but he also backed the Pitt Acts, which made trade unions illegal, and he viewed unions as a general disease in society. So please, mark the bicentenary by acknowledging the African slaves and abolitionists such as Harriet Tubman, Olaudah Equiano, the Maroons, Toussaint Louverture, who risked or lost their lives to fight for their and future generations' emancipation. And remember that slavery continued after the Act and exists in other forms today. Please also support the TUC campaign launched at this year's Black Workers' Conference for an annual Day of Remembrance. Congress, here we are, 200 years later, and black people are still suffering, facing discrimination at work, in service provision and wider society. And despite a commitment from the government for black history to be part of the national curriculum, there's little evidence of it happening in practice. During my son's 2 years at secondary school, only one topic of black history during one term was touched on, and at his previous primary school, I had to provide the school with reference material and information on black history. I've heard reports that children have been informed at school that black people's history began with slavery. Can you imagine what that will do to the morale of a black child being told that your people began their existence as slaves with no mention of the great African empires such as the Nubians and the ancient Egyptians that have existed since the beginning of time, and the great achievements of black people throughout history, and to be teased by other children because of this misinformation? How can we expect young people to grow up feeling valued and achieving? And how can we prevent a future generation of racists growing up if we don't educate young people with the truth? The time has come for the lip service given to black history in the curriculum to end, and for the truth to be told in the school history books. In the civil service, our employers refuse to carry out statutory race impact assessments, disregarding any negative impact on black people of their policies, yet the law that's in place that's supposed to prevent race discrimination isn't working in practice. And the programme of job cuts and relocation in the civil service has caused detriment not only to black workers but to service users as well. With a public sector race duty, we shouldn't need to lodge collective employment tribunal claims and judicial review action, but that's my reality as a PCS rep representing PCS black members. Finally, Congress, the legacy of slavery is still with black people today in all aspects of our lives. So in addition to acknowledging this legacy and Britain's role in the slave trade, we've got to stand up and fight for a society where all citizens are valued. where they have equal access, equal opportunities and equal rights. Please give this motion your wholehearted support, Congress.
Thank you very much. I'm calling Amendment 28, and that's to be moved by the POA. Amendment 28, moved by the POA.
Congress, Madam President, Colin Moses, POA. I would just beg your indulgence, Madam President, just to say to Congress on behalf of my union, I'd like to thank everyone for the support that was given to us last Wednesday, and the fight will go on. We made this amendment not to deflect from the main motion, as the speakers have already said, but there must be something we must remember when we look at the history. History impacts on today. History impacts on the very stereotyping of young black people in Britain, British society today. Every night we'll pick up switch on a TV and the media will bring forth a stereotyping of what is happening in our society, often putting forward a view that is totally wrong. We must have the role models. The speakers who went before me have spoke about the history, the true history of the terrible happenings of slavery. Yet, on a nightly basis, on a daily basis, we see black people stereotyped as gangsters, drug dealers, street crime. Not of the achievements that black people have brought to this society, that Africans have brought to this society. Why we say that this amendment is here, yes, let us look at the history, but let us look at today. Let us look at a society that still is divided, and divided against people of colour. I've been coming to this conference now for the best part of 10 years and heard debate after debate. And unfortunately, I have to say most of these debates take place after a Prime Minister or after a Minister, when people are leaving the hall. I would like to have had this debate when the Prime Minister was here, so because when he talks about Africa today, he should talk about Britain today. The Prime Minister made much of Nelson Mandela, and quite rightly so, in the statue that's been put up there. But if we're going to talk about role models, there's no greater role model. But we must remember that every time a media brings forward the idea that the only crime that seems to be portrayed in this country is black on black crime, it does not portray the work being done in our communities. It does not portray the way our young people have to force their way into the mainstream. And that includes the mainstream of this organisation, the mainstream of the TUC, the mainstream of political life, the mainstream of education. It's a disgrace that there are more black men in prison than there are on our university campuses, and that's been brought about of 10 years of New Labour. So when we talk about slavery, let's not capsulate it in men in long coats and wigs on saying nice words. Let's capsulate it in chains and whips. And let's also capsulate it in those same chains and whips are here today, driving down black people in educational terms, in forms of prison and in forms of the media portrayal. If everything you see every day is that you are the lowest, then that's what you'll be portrayed as. Let us stop this and stop it now and portray the people of this country correctly. If Gordon Brown wants to take us forward, let's take everyone forward. Please, just take us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To be seconded by NAPO.
Good afternoon, President, Congress. Micky McClelland from NAPO, the union representing probation and family court staff. Great damage has been done to young black people through the lack or denial of an education that fosters cultural consciousness and academic excellence. In terms of employment, it was, I think, somewhat disappointing not to hear the Prime Minister announce any specific initiatives for enhancing the employment prospects of young BME nationals in this country, thus countering the stereotyping of young black people. However, I would support his words of support for union learning representatives. Two reasons here. The evidence suggests that this job attracts members into active union involvement from minority groups who previously perhaps would not have played such an active role in their union. And secondly, because they provide the means whereby we can promote the essential lifelong learning skills within the workplace and perhaps explore and overcome the barriers facing such as young black people who may be particularly reluctant or reticent about further learning. The government's agenda on Skills for Life, with its focus on 16 to 19-year-olds, is a positive initiative, but we should ensure that the Learning Skills Council Action Plan includes specific requirements for young black men. Within our own sector, the community and criminal justice sector, we should promote life skills training through local education centres and community groups, ensuring that the Skills for Life assessments are undertaken and, more importantly, that provision is made. Our goal should be to ensure access to facilities and education for young black people is made available by positive action. And beyond education within probation, we should be working with local partnership agencies to provide service provision that is tailored to the needs of young black people and is based on informed cultural understanding. Programmes within probation and within the prisons, such as for drug misuse and anger management. I ask you to support this amendment.
I'm conscious we're right on the time, but I do want to try and get another speaker in. So if I could call the next speaker, and if you could just try and if you could cut anything short, really do, because I'm over my time, but it's really quite important. I think we have debate on this.
President, Congress, Bev Miller speaking on behalf of Unison. Congress, I'm standing before you today as the descendant of an enslaved African in the year that Britain marks the 200th anniversary of the Act tabled by William Wilberforce calling for an end to the transatlantic slave trade. The celebrations of Wilberforce's contribution to the abolition movement often creates a blind spot to the role played by black Africans like Weno, Clarkson, Mary Prince and Equiano, among countless others who, when exploited, organized themselves and physically resisted those who enslaved them. It was their actions that made the slave trade unsustainable and brought about the passing of the 1807 Act and their own emancipation. Congress, the abolition of slavery did not eradicate the idea of racial purity and hierarchy. The Race Relations Act of 1976 and the statutory amendments to that Act have failed to eliminate institutional racism. Black women and men are still more likely to be unemployed, work in junior positions and earn less than their white counterparts. They are often concentrated in particular sectors and occupations while virtually excluded from others, irrespective of their qualifications or work experience. Black members within Unison have been campaigning hard to force public services to take seriously their duty to combat racial discrimination, to promote training for black workers, and to adopt measures to tackle the exploitation of black women workers. Labour has recently decided to include the teaching of slavery and the slave trade within the national curriculum. I believe our education system should play its part in promoting a more inclusive society that is anti-racist and acknowledges the achievements and contributions made by black people. Black workers' history and involvement in trade unions reflects the lessons learned from our role in the abolition of our enslavement and those who supported us. Unity is strength, people working together to take a stand against injustice. This is a positive legacy which we need to carry forward in 2000 and beyond. Congress, an injury to one is an injury to all. Please support the motion.
Thank you very much. Okay. If you can be very quick, we'll just get you recorded and you can say a few words rather than less. I'm really sorry about this, but I just want to try and get a bit of debate.
Roger King, NUT. I'll try and read quick. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of chairing the TUC Black Workers' Conference. And at that conference, there were a number of excellent debates and many heartfelt and impassioned speeches, but none more so than the debate on slavery. So it's fitting that this motion was put forward for further debate in the wider trade union movement. The enslavement of people in whatever circumstances is an abomination. The transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity itself. As we commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Act of the British Parliament to abolish the slave trade, we should not forget that Britain played by far the largest part in the transatlantic slave trade. Neither should we forget that after the legislation of 1807, slavery continued to exist in the British colonies for another quarter of a century. Even then, the majority of slaves continued to live a miserable and impoverished existence, whilst former slaveholders were compensated to the tune of £20 million, billions of pounds at today's value. As we commemorate the bicentenary, who could deny that much of the racism that we see today is not a legacy of the slave trade? This year should not be so much a commemoration of an Act of Parliament, but more a celebration of the contribution that black people have made, not only during those 200 years, but indeed to history itself and the shaping of the world, but also the contribution we continue to make to today's society. This includes the often forgotten and rarely mentioned contribution that our forebears made to the abolition. It is not the gift of some religious philanthropists, but the resistance against overwhelming odds of the slaves themselves that ended slavery in the 1830s. Let us honour their resistance, their names in most cases unknown, and celebrate their courage. I believe as teachers we have a responsibility to make each succeeding generation of pupils aware of the injustice and inhumanity of the slave trade, but also, and more importantly, to the historical and contemporary contribution made to the world by black people. Our history did not begin with a benevolent Act of Parliament 200 years ago. We also have a duty to ensure that each succeeding generation of pupils, regardless of their ethnicity and background, are given the best possible opportunity to fulfil their potential. All too often this is not the experience that black parents take from our school system. But as teachers we also have an entitlement denied by successive governments to be freed from a restrictive Eurocentric curriculum, to be innovative and creative, to be freed from a test-driven regime, and to have the ability and wherewithal to provide an education system that meets the needs of all our pupils and the aspirations of their parents. To this end, my union, the National Union of Teachers, launched a charter this year on promoting the achievement of black pupils, Born to be Great, which brought together black students, parents and teachers. It is intended to empower all those within the school community and challenge and articulate their entitlements as well as their responsibilities. The lessons, the truth and the legacy of the slave trade and the pain, suffering and resistance of those who endured it must be used to eradicate contemporary forms of slavery and ensure that such a crime is never repeated. Please support the motion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.